So welcome to my next sew along, where I'm going to be sewing another version of this dress, which is the Estelle Dress from Sew Over It. The Estelle Dress is a pattern utilising knit fabrics, so it's stretchy and comfortable to wear, and it's actually surprisingly easy to sew. So let's get into it. So fabric-wise, my first Estelle Dress was made from a lovely forest green stretch velvet fabric, which is absolutely lovely and silky and soft to touch. Very comfortable to wear, it's stretchy, but it does give quite a more glamorous feel to this dress. So I haven't worn this day to day, unfortunately. I've only worn it on nights out so far. So in my second version, I do want to make something that's a bit more wearable day to day. So I've gone for this jersey knit fabric that I got from Lady McElroy Fabrics. So they have opened a new shop in Harrogate, if you didn't know. It's in Westminster Arcade on Parliament Street, and they've got a lovely selection of fabrics in there. And I purchased this a few weeks back, or probably more like months back now, and it is a lovely sort of multicoloured fabric. It's got shades of turquoisey green, orange, grey and white, all sort of woven in to each other. So I think this will make for a bit more of a casual day-to-day dress. That's what I'm hoping. And the fabric suggestions that Sew Over It give for the Estelle Dress are light to medium weight knit fabrics like jersey, bamboo jersey, French terry or lightweight cotton jersey. So I think this will fit in quite nice. So design-wise, the Estelle Dress is quite unique. I think it doesn't have any zip or button closures. It's just a pull on over your head type of dress, and then it has a tie at the side. So this is a separate pattern piece that you need to cut out, and that's sewn into the side seam. And then this part of the tie is actually part of the top and bottom of the front part of the dress, and then that gets tied at the side like that. So it's quite a unique construction and interesting dress to sew. So design decisions with the Estelle Dress are quite straightforward. First of all, there's the sleeve length, so you can either go for a long sleeve or a 3/4 length sleeve. And then with the skirt, it's either a long straight skirt or you can put a slit in the side. And on that version, the skirt is a little bit wider. So size-wise with the Estelle Dress, I cut out a size 10. For reference, my measurements are 34 bust, 28 waist and 36 hip. So I technically fall between the two sizes here, 8 and 10, but I generally always cut out a size 10 in Sew Over It patterns and then adjust if I need to. So you'll see with reference to the finished garment measurements that at the bust, this dress has negative ease. So that means that the finished garment measurements are 2 inches smaller than the body measurements, and that's because we're using stretchy fabric, so we want it to stretch around the body and hug the body nicely. At the waist, there's positive ease, so you can see the difference between 28 and 32.5, so that's 4.5 inches of positive ease, and that's because of the tie around the waist, that you cinch it in using the tie. And then the hip, there is negative ease again, so we've got body measurements of 38 inches and finished garment measurements of 34.5. So again, you've got negative ease there so that the dress will sit snugly around your hips. So yeah, I decided on to go with the size 10 in summary, and I also lengthened the bodice by 1 inch, and that's what I normally have to do with Sew Over It patterns. It's just a general adjustment that I need to make. So the Estelle Dress is a PDF only pattern, and I have already printed out and taped together my pattern pieces because obviously I've made this dress before. It's actually looking a little bit crumpled now because it's been sat in a folder for the last couple of years since I made the last version, but it will still be usable. I've just pressed it very lightly with a cool iron to try and get rid of some of those creases and wrinkles. So if you need some help in printing out and taping together your PDF pattern, if you've never done that before, I do go into that in a little bit more detail in my Sonny Jacket sew along. So I'll try and link that above, and if you have a look at that video, go into the description, find the contents and the timestamps, and you should see a PDF section there that you could use. So in terms of the actual pattern pieces that we need for the Estelle dress, we first of all need one of these pattern pieces. So this is the neck binding. We then need to cut one of this pattern piece, which is the tie that I showed you earlier on my green dress. We then need to cut a pair of sleeves, so that's that pattern piece. We then need to cut one of these bodice pieces. This is the back bodice, but that needs to be cut on the fold of the fabric. We then have this strange looking piece, which you can see at the top looks like the bodice, so that is in fact the bodice front, and it goes all the way down here, and this is part of the tie that I showed you earlier, and we need to cut one of those with the fabric right sides up. Then we need to cut our skirt back, so that's this long piece here, and that needs to be cut on the fold as well. And then finally there's this really massive piece here, which goes all the way up there, and that is the skirt front piece with the tie included, and we need to cut one of those with the fabric right sides up again. So here I'm cutting out my first piece of the dress, which is the skirt front, and we just need to cut one of these with the fabric right sides up. So I've just got my fabric laid out, just one layer with the right side facing me. I've placed the pattern piece down, this really big large one with a tie that extends all the way out here, and I have measured my grain line at both ends to the edge of the fabric to check that that's the same distance and on grain, and it is, and I'll now be cutting around this fabric piece. So that's the first piece that we need to cut out. So I'm now cutting out the bodice front, which is this big piece here. It goes all the way down to here, and that's the tie, and that is placed on the grain again. So I've measured from the top of the grain line to the edge of the fabric all the way down to check that that measures the same distance, and it does again. And then I'm also taking the opportunity to put down the tie piece as well, because that is a cut one, in the same way that this is a cut one. So the fabric is just one layer rather than folded. So I'm just about to cut those two out now. Just a quick tip, if you have got a very large piece of fabric and it doesn't fit onto the full length of your table, my table ends here, but I've got the rest of my fabric here just resting on my ironing board, to prevent it from dangling down onto the floor, because if it does do that, then it could start to stretch out the fabric in that area and distort some of the cutting that you're doing over here. So it's best not to have it dangling onto the floor. Always try and rest it on something, a chair or your ironing board or something similar, to prevent that stretching. I'm now moving on to cutting out my skirt back piece and my bodice back piece and the sleeve. And to save a bit of fabric, because these pieces have to be cut on a double layer, I have folded the fabric in half and then marked the centre line with pins, and then refolded the fabric so that both of the selve edges meet at that pin line in the middle. And then that gives you two folds, which you can use for any pieces which are cut on fold. So I have a fold here and I have a fold over there as well. So that means that I can cut this skirt back piece on this side and then the bodice back piece over there. And I think the sleeve will just about fit here. So the only other piece that we need to cut is the necktie, or the neck binding, sorry, and that one has a grain line which goes across like this, so we'll need to cut it in that direction. So once I've cut these ones out, I will place this down just on one layer in that direction and cut one of those out. So that's all my pattern pieces cut out, and before I take the paper pattern off the fabric, I'm going to mark the notches. So the notches are marked on the pattern with these little triangles, as you can see here on this sleeve piece. So I'm just going to take my scissors and snip into the fabric just by about 1/4 of an inch at those points. Just a tiny little bit that you can see there, and that's going to help me align the pattern pieces together once I get sewing them together. So we're now moving on to constructing the dress, which is exciting. So the first step is to take our tie piece, which is this one with a pointed arrow end, and fold it in half lengthways, right sides together, and align these edges and pin them together. So that's what I'm going to do now. And then when all of that is pinned, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew the short edge here and this long edge here at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So at the sewing machine, we need to make sure that we're using a zigzag stitch on our sewing machine rather than a straight stitch, because we're sewing with jersey knit fabric, and the instructions suggest that we follow a width of 1.5 and a length of 2 millimeters. So that's what I've set my machine to. And we also need to remember to use a jersey or stretch needle for sewing this dress because we're using knit fabric. So now this tie piece is sewn, we need to trim down our seam allowances by half of their width. Trim off the end here, being very careful not to catch the stitching, and then turn it through to the right side. And then we can use a pin to very, very carefully tease out this corner. It's a bit more of a pointed, sharp edge. Obviously be very, very careful that you're not catching the stitching and that you don't make a hole in the material. Now we need to take that to the ironing board and give it a good press. And it's sometimes a good idea to use a pressing cloth that looks something like this to put over your fabric piece whilst you're ironing it, just to protect the material from the heat of the iron. It doesn't have to be a special one like this. You could just use another piece of fabric that's quite heat resistant. It just helps to protect the fabric from the heat and prevent any kind of sheen that might occur from the hot iron. So now moving on to the next step, where I'm going to be joining together the front pattern pieces. So this is the front skirt with the tie at the top, and now I'm going to take my front bodice, which top looks like that, and then the bottom has this long tie piece, and I'm going to match that up to the tie piece on the bottom piece here, like so. And then I'm going to pin all the way from the side seam here along this tie piece, round the top and back round to the side seam here in this curve. So round here, up there, and all the way along. That's now all sewn all the way up to the end of the tie and round back here to the waist seam. So we need to trim these seam allowances to half their width and then turn it through in the same way that we did the previous tie. So I've now turned that tie piece through and given it a press at the ironing board. Now we need to just open it up and from the wrong side access these seams here, and then, difficult to show you, but the tie goes down there, and we want to open these seam allowances up and just snip into here and on the other side just before the tie goes down into there, so that we can then open those up like that to press them flat. I'll just get my scissors and snip into there very, very carefully, not snipping into the stitching line. So that's what that looks like. You can see I've snipped in just a teeny tiny bit there to open that out, and I've pressed this bit here, and then I'll do the same on the opposite side. So that's what it looks like now. This is the top front bodice. These are the side waist seams that I've pressed open, and the tie is in here, coming out the side here. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're now moving on to working on the back of the dress. So this is the back skirt piece. This is my back bodice piece, and I'm going to align these at the waist seam here, pin all the way across, and then sew that with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that waist seam is now sewn, as you can see there, and I'm placing it over my pressing sleeve and going to press the seam allowances open with my iron. And just putting it over that sleeve hem just makes it a bit easier to get right into the seam and press it nice and flat. So now we're moving on to joining the front bodice piece to the back bodice piece at the shoulder seams. So I'm laying them right sides together and then aligning the shoulder seams on the right and the left, and then pinning those together, and I'll sew them at the sewing machine with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And as I did with the waist seam, I'm now pressing these shoulder seams open at the ironing board now that I've stitched them in place. And the good thing about sewing with knit fabrics like this one is that they don't fray, so we don't need to worry about finishing these raw edges at all. And we can now move on to sewing our neckline binding, which is this long thin piece here. And the first step in doing that is folding it in half this way round, and then aligning these short raw edges and sewing across the top here at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I've now sewn that in place, and I've pressed those seam allowances open. And the next step is to fold this whole piece in half again, this way round, so that the wrong sides are together. Fold that all the way round, matching the notches here, and then we need to take our iron and press that in place so there's a crease along the top fold there. So we now need to apply our neck binding to our neckline on the bodice, and we need to use the notches on each of those pieces to help us place that accurately. So you can sort of work out where these pieces need to go if you look back at your pattern piece and line your binding piece up. So I'm lining it up approximately 5/8 of an inch from the end of the binding pattern piece, because obviously our seams are there inside. And then you can see that this is the notch here is the center front notch. And then we move it along, and we can see that there's another notch which is approximately there. Mine's a little bit stretched out, I think, but we can see that this one is the side seam notch. And then we just continue on, and we've got a notch here which is the center back, and then we go on to the opposite side. So that just helps to determine which notches are which before you put it onto the bodice. So with that in mind, I've now got my finger on the center front notch, so I'm going to pop that right sides together with the center front notch on my bodice piece, and then I'm going to grab a pin and pop that in place. And then I'm going to work my way around the neckline, and first of all find the next notch, which looks like it's going to be the seam here, the seam of the neck binding aligning with the shoulder seam. So I'm going to line those two up and pop a pin in there. That's quite a bulky area because there's lots of layers due to the seam allowances, so that will be quite thick to sew, so we just need to bear that in mind. And then work our way around So we've got another notch there, and we have to sort of stretch that a little bit to get the width or the length of the binding to match the length of the neckline. And there's another notch there, which I'm actually not sure what that one is. But we just need to continue working our way around. We can see there's a notch there which matches up with the other shoulder seam. So I'm going to pop a pin in here. And then just fill in the gaps. So that's now pinned all the way around the neckline. So the raw edges of the neck binding are matched with the raw edges of the neckline. And you can see there are one or two places where the neck binding seems to be a little bit bigger than the neckline itself. So where they occur, then when I'm sewing, I'm just going to be stretching the neckline very slightly to match like that. Only very, very slightly. We don't want to stretch it out of position or stretch it out of shape. So that's the neck binding stitched to the neckline all the way around. The instructions now want us to press the seam allowances up towards the neck binding like that, and then understitch them to the binding all the way around to secure them in place. And then the step after that is to then roll them over to the inside of the dress, rolling the seam line over so it's inside, and then top stitching all the way around. So that's what I'm going to do next. So that's the neck binding sewn in place. I did actually skip the under stitching step in the end and just went ahead and turned the neck binding to the inside and then top stitched all the way around. I did get a little bit stretched out as I was doing that, so I put nice steamy iron over it. Hopefully that's helped it to shrink back in place. So that's the neckline now done. So the next step is to attach this separate tie piece that we sewed earlier. So we need to lay our dress out right sides up with the front facing us. So this is my neckline, this is my armhole, and I'm working down to the waist seam here on the front. And then we need to align the straight edge of the tie piece centralized over this waist seam like that. Pin that in place, and then we need to sew that with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So that's now sewn. It's a bit difficult to show you really, there's lots of fabric going on here, but this is the tie piece that's actually attached to the bodice pieces on the left hand side as you look at the dress, and then this is the separate tie that we've just sewn on, centralised over that seam there. So I've decided to sew the version of the dress that doesn't have a slit. So my next step is to align the side seams right sides together from the underarm seam here. So this is the armhole. I'm starting to align side seams here, and I need to go all the way down to the hem, pin that on both sides, and then sew that with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you're sewing the other version of the dress with a slit in, then you need to do the same thing, but you'd need to stop sewing at the notch for the split, and you'll find that on your pattern piece. So I've sewn the side seams now, and I've just tried it on for the first time just to check the fit, and that looks good to me. I'm happy with that. It does actually look quite nice sleeveless, so I'm tempted not to put the sleeves on, but I have cut them out, so I think I'll put them on, but I might trim them down so they're a little bit shorter as we're getting into spring now. A shorter sleeve might be nice, but it has given me the idea to maybe do another version of this dress which is sleeveless for summer. I'm not sure if I've actually tied that tie correctly. I've just literally thrown it on very quickly. There might be a different way round to do that tie waist, but yeah, I think it looks okay. So we're now moving on to constructing the sleeves, and as I mentioned, I have cut these down. I literally just had the pattern piece on and then folded it back where I wanted it, and literally just trimmed across here. So yeah, I hope I won't regret that, but I think I will get more wear out of a shorter sleeve dress than a longer one in the coming months. So now we need to sew the underarm sleeve of each piece. So we take one, fold it right sides together, align this underarm seam here at both ends, pin in place, and then sew with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I've sewn the underarm seam here on both sleeves, and now I'm going to pop my sleeve hem inside the sleeve, which is wrong sides out, and just press those seam allowances open. So before we insert these sleeves into the dress, the instructions ask us to do the hemming of the sleeves now. So while I've still got it on my pressing hem, I'm going to turn up the bottom of the sleeve by 1.5 centimetres, so 5/8 of an inch, and press that all the way around. And then we need to top stitch it in place. So we can now move on to inserting our sleeve. So I've got my bodice the wrong side out, and I've got my sleeve right side out. There it is with the cuff sewn in place. And we need to insert the sleeve into the armhole like that. And then first of all, I'm going to align the side seams, make sure that they are on top of each other and the seam allowances pressed open, so that making sure that the seam is on top of each other at around the 5/8 of an inch mark, because that's where the seam intersection will be. And then I'm going to pop in one of these clover fork pins like that on either side of the seam line to keep that in place. And then we need to make sure that our notches are aligned. So this is the back of the sleeve, and we know that because it's got a double notch and the sleeve has got a double notch. So just check before you start putting it in that that double notch matches, because if you put the other sleeve in, you won't have the double notch on this side. So you want to put a pin in there and then move round, matching the notches all the way around. So here we've got the front notch. You can pop a pin in there. And then there's a notch at the top of the sleeve head, and that's matched with the shoulder seam of the bodice. So that goes like that. And then we just need to fill in the gaps, and I don't think we need to really ease the sleeve at all. It should all match quite nicely. So pin all the way around, and then we need to sew that at the sewing machine with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that's both sleeves now sewn in. I'll pull them to the right side. That's what they look like, and matched neatly under the underarm. So all we need to do now is sew our hem. So just as a reminder, I'm sewing the version of this dress without the slit, the split up the side. So all I need to do now is turn my raw edges over at the bottom of the dress, wrong sides together by 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch, press that all the way around, and then top stitch it at the sewing machine. If you're sewing the version with the slit or the split up the side, then you need to follow the instructions for that particular version of the dress, which will involve pivoting at your split notch around here somewhere, and then you'll effectively have a hem on either side of the split on both sides, and then you can do the bottom. And here she is, the finished Estelle dress. So I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. I really like the fabric. It's a lovely, soft, warm knit that is just nice for this time of year. I'm pleased that I did add the sleeves on, because I think even though it's getting to spring in the UK now, it is still quite chilly, so I'm pleased I've got that bit of extra coverage. But I like the 3/4 length, because I often just pull my sleeves up to that point anyway, so I think that's nice. I was a bit concerned that this fabric would be a bit thick with the tie, but I think it's actually turned out all right. And I like the sort of ruching on the waist area here. And yeah, overall, I'm really pleased with it. So I hope you found this sew along useful and valuable. And if you did, please do like and subscribe to my channel for more sew alongs and beginner sewing tips. And if you made your own Estelle dress, please do comment below and tell me what fabric you made it out of and how you found it, and if you're enjoying wearing it. So until next time, happy sewing!